good afternoon to everyone. I hope you're enjoying your time at the 2024 Esri Developer Summit. What you are about to witness is a technical workshop called Content Management using the ArcGIS API for Python, cloning and migrating content. So if that's not what you're interested in seeing, you might consider you're in the wrong room. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, let him introduce himself.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dan. I'm a solution architect and developer here with Esri Professional Services. Been in GIS for about 17 years now, working every sort of role, and find myself today doing a lot of solution architecture work and doing some development as well, in particular around content migration, promotion, backing up, and that's what I'll be talking about a little bit today as well.
And my name's John Yaste. I am a product engineer with the Python API team. And off we go. Okay, before we move into the presentation, I want to let everybody know that what the materials you see here will be available to you after the conference. So in addition to the proceedings site, when things go up there, the Python API team has a public GitHub repository at github.com/esri/arcgis-python-api. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. So when you get there, what you're going to do is when you get there, you will come to this page. Click this branch button, start typing the word conference underscore talks branch will appear. Click that. And there is a talks directory. And in there, you will see a list of all kinds of conferences where we've presented. There are all kinds of slides, notebooks, scripts within the different directories there. And within the next couple weeks, there will be a Dev Summit 2024 directory in there where this presentation and some of the other materials from different API sessions across the summit will be. Okay, so that's out of the way. What we've done is make some assumptions about you. I know we're always warned not to do that, but we had to draw the line in designing this presentation. So we're assuming that you are familiar with Web GIS content terminology and what goes on within a Web GIS. So we're not going to really explain what we're working with, right? We're just going to show you how to do some cloning. And in addition, we think you're here because you want to know, how do you do that? How do you move content between organizations? And also that you are familiar with Python, its syntax and its structures. So we're not going to explain the Python code that you're looking at and why we chose to do things the way we did. So our agenda, this is the outline of what we're going to talk about today. The first thing we'll talk about is, why do you move content? And then I'm just going to launch into a demo of cloning two of the most common item types that people talk about, feature layers and web maps. And then we're going to go back to the slides and take a look at the clone items method and where you get documentation on it, and talk a little bit about how it works and a couple of the parameters. And then I'm going to do another demo of cloning a different type of item, and then move into using a different means of moving content between enterprise deployments called the Group Migration Manager. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dan to do all the hard stuff. Okay, so why are you moving content? You need to get content from one place to another. Typically, people have staging or development setups. They do all the work, you get everything to where you need it to be, and now you need to get that into a location where it's time to produce. So let's move forward and go into looking at how to clone feature layers and web maps. So I ran this notebook before this because I didn't trust to do it live. So I'm just going to walk through the patterns of how you access the method and what you do with it. So first thing you're going to do is make your connections to two different organizations. calling one source and one target. And then I just go ahead and search or get the particular hosted feature layer that I want to clone. And in this case, and then I'm just going to print out some information about this feature layer to verify that what I expect to happen actually happens. So when I print the item ID of this particular feature layer and I look at its URL, I'm going to pay, I'm working with online organizations in this case. So particularly this first part of the path component of the URL is the specific organization ID of that feature layer. So when I clone it to another feature layer, I want both the item and the source data in that second organization. So I'm going to verify that by looking at that URL of my cloned output. Right? A quick visualization of what I'm trying to clone. And here is the syntax of cloning this item. So when you assign a variable to a GIS, it's going to have a property called content, which is going to return to you an instance of a ContentManager class within the Python API, and off of that class is where the clone items method resides. The parameter pay particular attention to, there's an items parameter where you give it a list of items that you want to clone. And that is the syntax of the method. So I ran this, and then I assigned a variable to my output, and I'm looking at the output here of my feature layer. So what I can see here right away is that this has a different organization ID. So both the item and the source data of this feature layer are cloned into that second organization. Another layer of verification. The visualization looks correct. So that's how you clone a hosted feature layer. And next, I'm going to go into cloning a web map. And again, I make my connections to the source and target organization, and I get a particular web map. And then I'm going to use Python's web map class to print what is in that web map. In this case, web map's made of base map layers and operational layers. This is the operational layer and the URL of that particular layer within the web map. And then I'm going to look at whether that web map actually exists in the target organization already. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the parameters of the clone items method in a minute, where I'll talk to you about how the search mechanism would know whether an item has already been cloned or is already in an organization. And something that I do with web maps in particular is just use this get data method to take a look at the structural definition of the web map behind the scenes. And again, this is where you can see content about metadata about the operational layers within that web map. And that's another way you can verify that the cloning is taking place the way you want it to. And here, the syntax of using the method, it's the same as what we just saw, right? This time you put a web map item into the items argument, right? And what you'll notice here is that in the output, what I see is the web map, but also the hosted feature layer came along with it. So in this case, in the case of a web map, the dependent hosted feature layers are going to come across with that web map. And when I go and sort of print the information about my cloned output, I can see, as in the case before, the organizational ID is different. I can be confident that that data is now hosted in the second organization, and I can verify that the information is correct. So when I clone a web map, when that structure is put back together and you had hosted content in the source web map, it rewires that cloned web map to use the cloned data. Make sense? Okay. All right. So back we go to the slides. Okay, so accessing the function, I talked a little bit about this, but just to review, when you make a connection to a Web GIS, you assign it a variable. So whatever you call it, it's going to have a property called content, which is going to return to you an instance of the class within the API called ContentManager. And that is the class that contains the clone items method. And we've seen this in action, but that is where you would go hunt down the more detailed documentation for this particular method. And here's what it looks like from the API reference. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of these parameters because this gives you some additional control over how things behave when you clone items. In particular, the search existing items parameter and the copy data parameter. Right? So with search existing items, the way cloning behaves, when you clone an item, and an item has an ID in whatever source organization you're using, when you clone it, the resulting cloned item is going to have a type keyword assigned to it, which is the literal word source followed by the word dash, or followed by a dash, and then the item ID from the source organization. So if you go to clone that into the same organization again and use the default search existing items equals true, that item is not going to be cloned again. So this is a way you can avoid duplicating information. If you have reason to duplicate it, by all means set this to false. But that is how that parameter works, and that's how you can avoid a lot of duplication of content when you're not looking to do that. The copy data parameter, I'm just going to show that in action in a minute or so. That one is pretty self-explanatory, but I'll show what that means. And now I'm going to go and show the cloning of an instant application, right? So just ignore all the pink. That's just failures and warnings. We don't need to pay attention to those. Okay, so we get the instant application item, right? And then again, that get data method on an item is going to return to you the structure of whatever item you're looking at behind the scenes. And depending upon the item, this can get really, really complex, or it can be really pretty straightforward like it is here in an instant app. But the thing I'm going to pay particular attention to, this particular instant app is using a web app map with this particular ID. And the clone items method is going to work the same as we've seen already with the previous demonstrations, right? Where I just grab that clone items method, use the items parameter to put a list. In this case, we're doing one, but you could want multiple items as well. And I'm going to clone it, right? And I'm going to ignore any warnings. And here's what the result looks like. So again, right, with an item like an instant app, you're going to get the instant application, the web map item, and any hosted content that's contained within that web map when you clone. So, and then you can verify it here with the get data, this web map. Now it looks, again, it's going to reconfigure the structure of that cloned app and rewire it to use the cloned web map and the cloned feature layer within that web map. And I talked a little bit about the copy data parameter, right? So again, here we're getting a feature layer, hosted content. Again, I'm looking at the URL here. If I change that copy data value to false, because by default it's true, I copy all the item information and the structure of the item, but I'm using the original source data. So I'm not moving the data anywhere. I'm not moving the actual features. They reside still in that original organization. So if you have cause to do that, that is how that copy data parameter works. Okay, last part of what I'm going to show is a method called group migration, right? And so when you're moving between enterprise deployments, this group migration manager is an option. This is not available in ArcGIS Online. But the way the group migration manager works is The workflow is that you can get a hold of a group from your organization, and then when you're accessing it in the Python API, it's going to have a property called migration, which will return to you an instance of a group migration manager object. What this will do will allow you to package up all the contents of that group into an item type called an export package. And then what you can do is download that package to your system or to your network somewhere, and then you can add that item into a target organization and load the contents of that package into a group that exists in the target. And this is used often in the enterprise world because you can preserve item IDs this way. So if you're looking at doing that, the item IDs from the source will be the same as when you migrate into the target group. Okay, so let's see how that works. So I again make my connections to my organizations, and I'm getting a hold of a group here. And then I'm listing out the content of that group. See a couple feature layers that look like they were published from shapefiles, right? And I've got that group object here. Like I said, there's a property called migration. It's going to return to you this group migration manager object. On that object is a method called create, which technically creates a geoprocessing job, which then you can pull and query until it's done. And then you get the result, which is an export package item, and you can inspect that to look at what the contents of this package are, right? And here it looks like it contains information and metadata about those initial 4 items that I packaged up. And then what I do is download it, so now it's available on my system, and I add an item into my target organization, setting the properties appropriately and making sure I set my data argument to where that package that I just downloaded is. And then once I have that item added, I'm going to get a hold of the group in my target organization, get an instance of its group migration manager, and then I'm going to load that package that I just added to the target into, I'm going to run load, which is going to create a job, and then I'm going to read the output to make sure that the results of that migration contain the content that I wanted it to. And in this case, it worked. It always will work. And if it doesn't, Dan can help you. Okay, so that is what I've got for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the structure of items and the data behind the scenes, and how you can deal with some of the more complicated item types within the platform.
Sounds good. All right, guys. So, so there's a little bit of a different way of doing it. You can call it the hard way, call it the fun way, but or the more geekier way. It's sort of the way I like to do things a little bit, but this is a little bit of a different way. Call it migration or cloning via backup. This helps enable workflows such as content promotion. So if you have a dev, staging, production environment, let's say you want to make changes to your content in your staging environment, and you want to promote it to your production environment after it looks all good. This is a step towards that. This can also be used for backing up your items. So if you want to back up your content from ArcGIS Online, ArcGIS Enterprise, check that on the version control. You can do that as well. This also gives you some more fine-grained control over the process and allows you to make some changes along the way. Let's say there's a global change that you want to make for all of your applications. So you have a color scheme that you want to change. You can edit it this way. So the way this works is we'll, of course, come in here and we'll first import ArcGIS.gis, pathlib, and JSON. Yeah, let me give that a shot. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to remember how exactly to make this bigger. view appearance. There we go. Zoom in. All right. How's that look? A little bigger? All right.
You're ruining it.
All right. How's that for you guys? Good? All right. What's that? I'm sorry? Oh, kill the lights.
I'm
A
done.
little better, I guess.
Just say no.
All right. Let's do this. So John made a fun little dashboard showing the protected areas in Kenya. And I want to move this into my organization. I like it. I want to steal it from him and take it for my own. So I'm going to go ahead and work on that. So, that's much better. I like it.
The most difficult audience in history.
So, first we're going to connect to our organizations, and I always recommend using profiles. I don't know if you guys do this a whole lot, but it's definitely a more secure way to go. So we're storing our credentials in profiles. So we're connecting to our source and our target. We're going to grab the source item. So we're grabbing the item object. We're going to download the data for that item. So we're doing source item.download. We're going to grab the thumbnail. We're going to grab the metadata. So now we want to, now we have all that stuff. We want to figure out when we're recreating that item, what properties do we want to keep from the original item? So we have here a list of properties that we want to use to recreate the item. And this will all be posted on GitHub somewhere as well, so you'll have the code to use. So now we know the properties that we want to keep. We can just run a simple dictionary comprehension here to grab the properties from that source item that we want to keep and move to our target. And we'll also grab the JSON. So we'll throw that into JSON for future use. All right, now we have everything that we need to recreate the item. So to add the item, we're going to go ahead and open that JSON that we saved. And we're going to go ahead and create the item. So we're just using content.add, throwing in here our item properties. We have our thumbnail, our metadata. After we create the item, we can go ahead and add some data to it. And let's go ahead and throw this all into a function, make it easier for future use. So let's take a look at the result. Come in here and look at it. Something's missing. That didn't go good. So what we have to do is we have to try that again, and we got to make sure we take care of our dependencies as well. So let's give that another shot. This right here is a function to assist in finding the dependencies for your item data. So essentially, this crawls the regex as a dictionary, or sorry, it crawls the JSON as a dictionary, including nested dictionaries. You pass in some regex, and it will return whatever matches that regex, essentially. So we have here some regex to find URLs and GUIDs as well. Now we have what we need to find all the item IDs inside of that JSON. So we're going to go ahead and run that find regex, and we see that we have this item ID inside of our JSON. But something else that you have to consider too is these items might not always exist within your organization as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Obviously, something that doesn't exist in your organization, you won't be able to clone, so you're just going to want to keep the existing connection to that item. And what about dependencies and their dependencies too? So you want to make sure that you look at the dependencies recursively. So you might have a web app, say an experience builder, dashboard, some of that good stuff, and you might have a web map inside of that. And that web map might have some views, and those views might be based on a hosted feature layer. And you want to make sure that you grab all of that content as well. So let's find those dependencies recursively. So essentially, we're just running that find regex again, and for each item ID that we find, we're interrogating that item ID and returning a list of dependencies from that source. One thing to keep in mind when the gotchas here is you don't want to try to migrate Esri-owned items. That will not work. So we have here a non-exhaustive list of Esri users. So you want to make sure you avoid these users. All right, now let's pull this all together and give it another shot. So we're going to find everything that we need to clone the item. So we're just running this find dependencies function. Now we have what we need to migrate all this. But one more thing though. We're going to use content.clone items to clone the host of feature services. Now, host of feature services can be pulled down and pushed back up again. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this. We're just trying to keep it a little simple. So for everything else, we're going to use the migration via backup. So we'll go ahead and run that. And we'll see that it ran, and we migrated a web map, we migrated two feature services and a dashboard. And now that that's all migrated, we got to go back through and update the JSON. We want to make sure that we have the correct item IDs for the migrated dependencies, as well as any URLs that might have changed. So we have here a function to go through the JSON and, again, look at the nested dictionaries and whatnot, nested lists, and replace the find and replace values, essentially. So we come through here, and we see that we have a replacement dictionary, and we go through and we replace everything, and we see that all of the items are updated. Now, we can sit back and admire our hard work, and let's take a look at it. And that looks good. Looks just like a dashboard that we liked. So yeah, and as I mentioned, you can also, this is just really a building block for bigger things. You can do a lot of work in here for modifying your items, like I said, backing them up. Another big use case that we see as well is sometimes folks have either two ArcGIS Online organizations, or they're moving from ArcGIS Online to Enterprise, or they're moving from Enterprise to Online, or Enterprise to a newer version of Enterprise that was stood up side by side for upgrade. In this case, this is a really good way to move data around for that as well. But yeah, that's what I got. Back to you, John.
There's a quiz on that workflow before you leave today. Okay, the last thing that, can you hit 4 there? No, there it is. The last thing that I'm going to show is what we use, or at least what the method I know how to use to troubleshoot cloning when it doesn't quite work. You're gonna make me enlarge this. All right, I'm gonna try something here. Better?
Don't make it up.
No. Okay, so this is what I've set up in here. Is I've set up a function inside a Python script that will allow Fiddler to run behind the scenes so that I can track the network traffic when I run the clone items method. Right. So, I didn't write this. So somebody else gave this to me because I was throwing my computer around the office when couldn't get Fiddler to work. So somebody did it. So anyway, this will allow me to run Fiddler and actually see the REST requests that go between the two organizations. And this can be really helpful when, as may happen, items fail to clone. Right? Don't tell anyone I said that. So what I've done is I've started this script, and then I've gone out to Fiddler, and I'm going to filter it just to look at the network traffic from my Python process here that I can get here. This is where I know the process of my Python procedure or my Python script, and then I'm filtering that traffic, right? So all right, I've gone and grabbed this particular item from an organization that, right? And so you see, I'm getting that item from my organization, and I can just to show you what the output in Fiddler looks like, right? Then you see that code, when I get an item in the Python API, here is the actual request that gets sent across the internet, right? So this is the endpoint of the actual server architecture that you're hitting to get that information. And you can see parameters that were sent and look at the response, right? And this is how, this is, when we can't figure out, this is what, these are the big guns, right? This is what helps you figure out what's happening, right? So and this particular item, I have been unable to get to clone, right? And so either because I'm doing it in front of people, it's gonna work, because it never works when I do it by myself, or else it's gonna fail, and we're gonna see if we can actually take a look at what errors come back here. But what you can see is that behind the scenes, Clone Items is doing a crap load of work, right? It's sending all kinds of requests, right? And it is, and particularly in the case of a hosted feature layer like this, which is it's a feature layer with a lot of features and a lot of complex geometries. And so those items can be tricky to clone. So I just wanted to give a brief demonstration of it, if you can figure out how to get Fiddler to work on your system, right? And you can find somebody at the conference that knows how to do that, right? That is the way that you can actually really get down to the bare bones of what's happening behind the scenes and troubleshoot and see when, and it doesn't just work on Clone Items, right? Whenever things aren't working, this is a way that you can see how the Python API is actually operating, right? Because when you're writing Python API code, it's calling into your organization's REST endpoints of the servers and the portals and all your components and sending requests. So that REST API documentation will really help you out with using the Python API as well. So yeah, that was what I wanted to show. So and now this seems to, right, so this is processing through here. So no, it looks, if this worked, I think that worked, right? It worked because I did it in front of you. I did this afternoon. I practiced this presentation before doing this. It did not work at 11:30. Actually, I'm gonna go check and see if that did work. I'll be. All right, so that's how you fix all your problems, is you bring it to somebody when you're at your wit's end and you show it to them, and it'll work. That's been true my entire career. Okay, so yeah, that is what we had to present, right? So we're going to open this up to questions from you. Yes?
Possibly a dumb question will get removed by your first assumption, but does this only work between different organizations, or can you make copies of stuff if they just have a dev, test, and prod, like folders within a portal?
The question is, can you clone between the same organization? And the answer is yes, you can. Like it doesn't have to be between different organizations. I don't know if you have any experience with it. You may run into conflicts with service naming between, depending upon what your source files are. I don't know if you,
Because I was just saying how you had the same ID after something got cloned, but you obviously couldn't have the same ID in the same port, but if it's a different folder, is that different enough? Or?
no, when you clone, you're getting different item IDs in the target organization. The group migration manager between enterprise deployments is what is going to allow you to take group content, and then you can preserve the item IDs in a second organization. It'll have the same item IDs from the source, but that isn't possible within the same organization.
And I should also add too that specifying your item ID is something that you can only do in enterprise. It's not available in ArcGIS Online.
Yeah.
Correct, yeah.
But
Was that? Oh yeah, so persisting your item ID, you can only do that in ArcGIS Enterprise. You can't do that in ArcGIS Online. You can actually choose like, the same workflow. If you have a special item ID that you like, as long as it's a valid GUID, you can choose your own too. Just fun.
Yeah, does this API have any capabilities for standalone services or only for hosted services?
so the question is, so you can you connect to a standalone ArcGIS server?
Yeah,
Yes, you can. You can.
I realized this wasn't about that.
Yeah, no, this isn't about that, but I believe there is a code snippet on how to do that in the server manager.
Oh, great.
Or it's in, there is one back here. I'll find it somewhere. Yeah.
I just wanted a yes or no answer, basically.
Yes, you can.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The easiest way to work with organizations that are authenticated differently, so an AUL versus an enterprise that's authenticated through AD Active Directory.
Well, the way you use, so the question is, what's the best way to work with organizations that are authenticated differently, right? So, well, when you're cloning content, once you've made your connections, nothing changes. And depending upon your authentication, there's different syntax for how you make your connection and different arguments you can use. And I would refer you to this guide page on authentications, which is going to tell you how to connect. But once you're connected, how you retrieve items and how you clone things doesn't change. No.
Yeah, could you elaborate a bit more as to why some dependencies wouldn't copy over using the clone items? Is there
Can we elaborate more on why certain item dependencies do not clone over?
Yeah, I just want to get a sense of what items will probably be problematic.
Oh, there we go. So using the content.clone items, there may be some limitations. However, in theory, everything can be done. You can pretty much clone any item using the workflow that I presented as well. But I believe,
Yeah, I think what I'm going to refer, there is a document out here that talks about cloning and troubleshooting complex items. Right? The thing I can tell you that where I can elaborate on where things get tricky with cloning, but I think we have worked through a lot of those in this clone items method. But some items have a much more complex structure than do others, and so an item like a dashboard that Dan showed, the way he did that differently was it's what dependencies or its supporting information is stored very differently than the dependent information for like a web map. Where like a web map just creates a JSON structure that references ID values. Things like story maps, dashboards, survey 123 items, they have very complex sets of resources in addition to that item definition. So there's a lot of behind the scenes configuration that takes place when you clone something like a dashboard. It has to go and pull out item resources and reconstruct those on the back end. That's why clone items isn't going to work directly for dashboards. And the same for story maps, right? Their JSON structures don't allow for the rebuilding the way what are sort of defined as text-based item types. Those item types have a lot of, at least what I think are binary structured resources that you have to do some of the remapping that Dan showed in order for that to happen. Yeah.
Because story maps, they are supported in the latest version, right? The new story.
So the question is, are story maps supported in the latest version? They are, right? This document here walks through the cloning of story maps and dashboards in particular, right? Yes.
In terms of like best practices, you have a bunch of web maps that all reference items that might, be in all of those web maps. You clone them, like in terms of the best way to do that. If you clone them all over and you use that search existing items, is that going to prevent you from having like multiple, or is it going to create multiple copies of each shared item?
No, the question is sort of best practices if you have a number of web maps referencing a number of feature layers and you clone into another organization, right? If you leave the search existing items parameter at its default value, right, and you clone a web map that has a hosted feature layer, but then if you go to clone either that web map or that feature layer that may be referenced in some other item, the target organization is going to know that item has already been cloned. So I think what will happen is that your cloned output will be able to rewire itself. And if that doesn't work, what you can use is there's an item mapping parameter inside the clone items method. So if you were to clone a feature layer from organization A and you already had, like you wanted all the item properties, the JSON structure of the actual feature layer item, you wanted all that stuff, like the layer symbology, all that kind of stuff that's stored in the actual JSON definition of the item, but you wanted to use an already existing feature layer. You can clone that feature layer item and set a parameter, an item mapping parameter, which is basically just a Python dictionary of the source item ID, and the value of that dictionary is the target item ID. And that way, when you reconstruct the JSON of the cloned feature layer, it will replace that item ID. Does that make sense? You could come to the island if you've got more questions about that. But like if you had hundreds of web maps and hundreds of feature layers and they're all intertwined, theoretically it should work, right? But I've never done it, right? So you'd have to play around with it and see what happens.
And just sort of related to that, when you, let's say I clone a web map over, is the expectation that now when I go into my content page on my target organization, that I will see items for both the web map and all of the layers contained?
Yeah, so the question is the expectation. When you clone, say, a web map from the source to the target, when you go look at the target web map item, are you going to see the web map? You're going to see it's going to be identical to your source representation, right? Keeping in mind, like if your web map has referenced layers versus hosted layers, you're going to, like your reference layers, the information will be cloned, but it's going to be referencing the exact same source data that is referenced in the original source item. Hosted content, the data will actually be moved over unless you tell it not to.
Yeah, so I have a question. Do you have a suggested way to do it? So if you have an experience builder that is using a web map that also has multiple dashboards and the dashboard is using survey 123, do you clone from experience builder or do you suggest cloning the survey 123, cloning the dashboard, cloning the web map, and then cloning the experience builder?
Rebuild it. No, I think this document that I have up here talks about Experience Builder as well, like how you clone that. So if you have an Experience Builder application that's referencing multiple dashboards and multiple Survey 123 items, and those are referencing web maps and hosted feature layers, I would say trial, you're gonna have to try it.
Thank you.
Yes.
No question. I just wanted to say thank you for your work as you're giving us our time back, and I appreciate it.
Oh, that's kind of you. Thank you. Sure. That's what we're here for. Yes.
Just with the clone items and the group migration tool, do they copy or do they clone the sharing and the folder structure or clone to the folder structure from the source?
That's a good question. Not to my knowledge. Like you may have to reset those sharing properties, right? So if you have it shared to the organization in representation A and you clone it, will the sharing come over? Do you know the answer to that?
With content.clone items, it will not. However, that is easy enough to get those properties, or not get those properties, but get the sharing information and reassign that sharing information in the target organization. So you might be sharing with specific users, specific groups. That's something that you could pull down ahead of time and do after you're done cloning your item.
I mean, you need to be aware of who's the owner of the item as well, because you need to be a member of that group. Even if you're an administrator, you still need to have yourself to all the groups to be able to clone out people's items and share them.
Yeah, the comment is you have to be aware when you connect to a GIS, whatever credentials you connect as, that determines what permissions you have to do anything within either organization. So if you connect as a source admin and then you're connected to the target as a user or a publisher, failures may occur depending upon what you're cloning, right? So those credentials matter as to what you're going to be able to do.
And beyond that, you might run into a scenario where you have an item that's shared to a group that the owner is no longer part of. You might run into some issues with shared update groups, offline areas, things like that. In those cases, the way I typically approach it is to, like for the example of an owner who's no longer part of a group, you'll just temporarily add that owner to the group, do your work, move them away from the group. So that those sort of workflows will support that, yeah.
Thinking about the auth running complex items to work between different versions of ArcGIS Enterprise, so let's say ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise. Would you rather keep one method?
So the question is, are there any issues with cloning between different versions of ArcGIS Enterprise or different versions of, or if you're between ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise? With clone items, not that I'm aware of, right? Like I think you should be able to clone between releases of Enterprise, and I mean, it may depend. Like item support may be different between releases, but the clone items method will work between releases of Enterprise and between releases of ArcGIS Online. The group migration manager, I believe, is a different story. Like I think the versions of Enterprise, if you're using Group Migration Manager, have to be at least equivalent. Not positive about that. We'd have to consult the doc. But I think Group Migration Manager, you have to be, if you're going to go from one enterprise to the other one has to be at least at the same version as the source enterprise.
So the one area I've personally run into that as well is trying to move from ArcGIS Online to ArcGIS Enterprise dashboards. The version of dashboards on ArcGIS Online right now is newer than the version that's in ArcGIS Enterprise, so you'll run into a conflict there.
Yes?
Could you have equivalently in your demo, you had the regex for item IDs or URLs and GUIDs? Could you have equivalently used the item mapping parameter of the clone items method?
So the question is, with what Dan displayed with the regular expressions, the regex that filtered out item IDs, can you use the item mapping? I'll let you answer that. I just want to make sure everyone heard the question.
Oh yeah, for sure. So those are really sort of two different things. In that process, we were looking at the JSON, we were finding all of the GUIDs and URLs inside of it, and then we were going to replace all of that in the JSON. However, using content.cloneItems, that's automatically done, right?
Sorry, I missed that.
Updating the JSON when you use content.cloneItems.
Yeah, like the JSON structure itself is updated. Yeah.
The new item IDs and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. So what's the difference on the back end between the backup method and the clone items method?
So I'd say the biggest, so I can't really speak too much as to the back end of content.cloneItems. It's pretty complex code. I've looked at it a little bit, but I think functionally the biggest difference between that process and the process I showed is you're actually pulling all that stuff down into file-based artifacts. So you're persisting that locally rather than just going from portal to portal, AGOL to AGOL.
Yeah, the behind the scenes, the clone items method is doing fairly complex things. Like it's basically deconstructing whatever item you've given it and somehow populating an internal structure with the actual data of that item, depending upon what item type it is. It's also got to get the data. If, like, for a feature layer item, the data doesn't live inside the item, the actual features. They live in a database behind the scenes further. And so that's how, like, item structures are deconstructed, put back together, and then if we saw with that, when you're doing a feature layer, right, it runs just hundreds and hundreds of apply edits calls to repopulate the newly constructed feature layer. So it depends on the item type and how its supporting data is stored as to what happens behind the scenes. So there's no real one-size-fits-all answer to your question. Yes?
Can you speak more to sort of cloning of items that have image services? And so specifically speaking about going from an ArcGIS Online to an ArcGIS Online. And so I know it's not supported and like trying to figure out ways of cloning those objects to various different organizations without having to sort of redo that whole thing.
Yeah, image services don't clone. So, well, that I don't know, but I'm assuming no. But I think my limited knowledge of image services themselves, right? Like you would have to republish that service in the target organization. Like that's the only way I would know how to do it. If there are ways of doing it in some press a button manner, like through some other means, there's something called the AGO assistant that does things, but I don't think that works either, right? I don't think that it's possible to pull the data out from wherever it's stored behind the scenes in whatever server has the actual bits and bytes that make up the actual image to get that over to the target organization and have it stored in that architecture.
So image server is, most of the time it's basically just pointing to a file location of wherever the image is stored. In that case, the approach that I would recommend taking though is finding the service definition, cloning the service definition itself, and then republishing the service definition in the target environment. As far as moving those images, like John mentioned, that's another story.
Yeah, way in the back.
You just said republishing the SD file. Do you have workflow cloning reference feature layer and image layer? Is this the way you suggest cloning reference feature layers? republishing it?
So the question is, how do we recommend cloning referenced feature layers? Well, with referenced feature layers, what that item is referencing data that lives in some other organization or in some data store you've configured with your organization. So to clone that actual item to another organization, it's just going to reference that same data that lives in the source organization or lives in whatever data store you've configured. So the only way to reconfigure that would be to set up an identical data store in the second organization if you wanted it to be hosted, but it's not hosted in the first place.
Yeah, but I mean, you recommend having a test stage and plot system, but we don't have a real workflow to getting our reference feature layer. We have it on a database and getting it to the other database in our stage system. Is there any plans to get a workflow for this problem?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. You come talk to us at the island and we can go into more details about what you're looking for in terms of that and how that would work.
Okay, you're the API?
The Python API island, sure. Yeah. Yes.
So just to add to that, we have CI/CD systems where we publish, we have Python to publish those map services. We then capture the item ID, populate that into like a dictionary of services and items across the different environments. And then when we do our JSON, capture the JSON, we then do a find and replace with those reference feature services. It sounds complex. It's actually pretty simple.
Okay, so she made a comment that what their organization does is with map service, you clone map service, you keep a repository somehow of item IDs, and then when you clone things, you do a bunch of replacement with, yeah.
So we just publish like what you used to do, like you said, we can just publish your maps to your different environments, but this time you're capturing information of the item ID in the new environment.
She solved everybody's problems. Thank you for that. Thank you.
So can you use an item mapping then on the clone function? Is there, like, say this is the old, like this is the dev server's ID, and this is the test server's ID? Can you share?
Yeah, that's how the item mapping parameter works with yeah.
And so then that would, when you move the map, then they would say that this takes this item ID and replace it with this one sort of thing. Right?
Yeah, that's what it'll do, but with the underlying JSON structure of whatever item you're cloning. Yes.
Yeah, I do my own item mapping, but would the built-in item mapping also replace the URLs? Would it go out and fetch the URLs from the item IDs, or
Say that again.
would the built-in item mapping parameter, would that only replace the IDs, or would it replace the URLs for those IDs as well?
What item type are you referring to? Like, so a feature service. If you, yeah, it'll, because the item ID it's replacing will use it's hosted at a different URL than the original item. So URL is part of that JSON. It'll replace that. It'll rewire it. If you have a different experience and can show, then we've got something to work on. Yeah. No, but the item mapping, if you've already got an item in the target organization and you map the item ID, it's going to remap all its metadata as well in the URL.
What table are you guys at in that stuff?
There's the kiosk up top is labeled Python, and then there's ArcPy and notebooks and API for Python. It's sort of straight back right when you walk in. I'm going to go over here.
Thank you. When you do a component hosted feature layer, often they have created by modified dates and names of users. Are those respected in the cloning process?
The created and modified values.
The auto attribute change values in the field, where if I create a record, it'll tag my name.
Like editor
create a
tracking.
date.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's valuable information in that table.
So are you talking about editor tracking?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also when you do a server 123 survey, it's tagging the date and the name of the field cache, the person.
And that's recorded in the feature service, right?
Incorporated into the attribute table.
Yeah, that's the service.
Is that respected in the cloning process?
Yeah, as far as I know, like if it's hosted and you clone it to a second organization, all that comes across.
That should be respected.
That should be respected.
It's not.
It's not, you're saying.
I don't believe it is, but
Okay, come and show us, and actually there may be an issue in our repo that, well, yes, as far as if it's an attribute value, it should come across. But I don't know, editor tracking may behave differently.
And sorry, to carry on from that, items have metadata like view count, for example. Is that also something that is carried across?
Yeah, that's in the JSON structure. If it's in that JSON structure, it'll be copied over. Unless it's set up as 0 because it's just being born in that new organization. You'd have to look at it. Like, I don't know. But I think it should just rebuild that JSON for the item. Yeah.
So do you guys have plans to make some of your clone item error messages a little bit more specific? I do get pretty frequently things like failed to create feature service. So I like that you mentioned Fiddler, add that to my toolbox as far as debugging, but it would be awesome. They were a little more specific in those cases.
I don't know. Like, do we have plans to change how we report the errors? Not that I know of, right? But Fiddler is how you're going to be able to track which particular component of that cloning is failing, right? Like, if we can make more detailed error messages, it's something we can look into. Okay. Thank you for